Tanto Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Readers and the Cross by Patrick Larsimont, narrated by Antony Ferguson. Prologue. Scotland, Autumn 1990. Melanie McNabb's grandfather had always been there, the one constant in her life, the anchor against whatever the tempest might throw at her. He was there when her father left and when her mother, her grandfather's only daughter, unravelled, her drinking making her irrational, inconsistent, and frankly terrifying. Not the environment for a timid adolescent to grow up in. He was always there saying, "Don't worry, my love, I'll be your top cover. Just look up and you'll see. I'm always there." She didn't understand what he meant until she was older, but yes, her grandpa Bang Bang had always been there, on overwatch throughout her life. Her hero, her eye in the sky. He was gone now, and it had taken over a year to get a lid on the grief, containing it where it could do no harm. She'd used that time to learn about his part in the Battle of Britain, and had found the remains of his most implacable foe, the ME-110 fighter ace, Hauptmann Otto Werner, who had so very nearly vanquished him early in the war. She'd uncovered the circumstances that saw young pilot officer Jeremy "Jocks" McNabb awarded the George Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. But most intriguing of all, she was on the trail of Alice, the mysterious woman he'd almost been court-martialed for, and for whom he'd held a candle throughout his life. She wasn't Melanie's grandmother, so who was she, and what had become of her? It had taken all of Melanie's courage to face the prospect of returning to Scotland to tidy up her grandfather's lodge on the Dundonald estate in the southern highlands of Perthshire. She'd been making excuses that it was too far from London, but in truth she was frightened of the ghosts of happier, innocent times, and how they might affect her barely contained grief. When she closed her eyes, she was transported to halcyon days, playing hide-and-seek through the verdant fields and woods of the estate. Her task was always to hide, and his to find her, but in their version of the game, he would sneak up on her once spotted and give her a delicious fright by roaring, "Bang, bang, bang!" Her squeals of delight would see them dissolve with laughter, especially if he'd got her good. The name had stuck. Grandpa Bang Bang. The estate belonged to a family of foreign aristocrats. The factor, Angus Dundonald of that ilk, once explained that the land had belonged to his family, but had long since been sold to pay death duties. He told Melanie that his employers had a great debt of honour owed to her grandfather, and the lodge was gifted to him and his descendants in perpetuity with their eternal gratitude. Angus said he'd only ever met his lordship, as he insisted on calling him, half a dozen times during the salmon season, fishing the isla that bordered the estate. With his advancing years and increasing infirmity, he came less often, but Angus had fond memories of Jocks and the laird enjoying whisky-fueled nights and baying lustily at the moon together. "Aye, they were grand old pals," he recalled, "close as brothers." Melanie was back in this familiar space, so full of treasured memories. It was hard to take the stale metallic tang of ash in the wood burner, or the musty mildew in the rooms she'd abandoned for almost 2 years. Feeling guilty, she drifted forlornly from room to dark room, the melancholy familiarity of everything crushing. It was just the skeleton of the past with all the flesh and sinews of life long gone. Walking up the creaking stairwell, she found dozens of images of her younger self on the wall, pink and windswept on some sunny beach, blonde hair in a bird's nest and eyes shining with youthful exuberance, proudly holding a baby tooth that had required her grandfather's string and door trick to shift. An awkward teenager, blushing in her first proper frock, bought for her leavers ball from boarding school at St. Leonard's in Fife, and a more confident 20-something in her graduation gown, posing hand on hip for her grandfather's camera. Each and every chapter of her life was captured and displayed here, and yet so much of Jocks's own life remained a mystery. There were so few pictures of him. Those he allowed were black and white group shots of men in uniform. As a child, she'd played an early form of Where's Wally, trying to find a young Grandpa Bang Bang in the sea of faces. The largest picture was over the mantelpiece, a squadron portrait annotated Montrose, 1941. The men were grouped in front of a sleek black Spitfire, its huge propeller and outstretched wings looming over them like a protective mother raptor over her eaglets. The earnest faces of these determined young men had stared at her all her life, always challenging her to do better and be worthy of their sacrifice. She recognized some, like Uncle Pritch, for example, but others were unknown. It was her desire to know more of their stories that had driven her interest and eventual studies. She had decoded the nicknames inscribed in the margins of the picture, which she knew by heart: Pete, Badger, Pritch, Cam, Miro, Gilly, Wee Broch, Bubbles, Solly, Big Stick, Moggs, Kanga, Roo, Wally, Axel and Otmar. A strange collection, like the heroes of a Tolkien tale. Reciting their names had often soothed her to sleep or calmed pre-exam nerves. They were so familiar that they became the unexpected catalysts that drove her to academic achievement through to her PhD and career as a military historian and curator with the Imperial War Museum. In time, she had discovered the fate of some of the men, but others were reduced to a solitary line in dreary wartime reports or a statistic on the websites of aviation enthusiasts. Some had disappeared without a trace, lost and forgotten, and perhaps still lying beneath the sod or sand of some lonely foreign clime. There were survivors, of course, like her grandfather and Uncle Pritch, but none of them were left untouched by what they'd seen, endured, and suffered as young airmen. Some scars were visible, others weren't, and perhaps these were the most painful of all. At first, it was frightening to wake in the middle of the night to the sound of Grandpa Bang Bang's screams. He would call out, warning unseen friends of unseen foes. In time, she'd got used to it and realized it was just her grandfather having another one of his dreams. He was always back the next morning, smiling and kind, and always there for her. Melanie decided she would start by sorting through his clothes. He didn't have that many, always a man keen to avoid excess. He would joke that he was just a tight Scotsman, but it was typical of a wartime generation for whom thrift and economy became second nature through necessity rather than desire. When dressed casually, he favoured a combination of Perthshire farmer's tweed, an army surplus serge and denim. Melanie always pictured him in green, army green, the colour of the pongos he so enjoyed taunting. He wore V-neck jumpers from faithful old M&S or Aitken and Niven, but always with holes at the elbows. A tattershawl shirt and sometimes a cravat. "Reminds me of my flying days," he'd say with a wink and smile. At the other extreme, his wardrobe contained all manner of formal wear. Kilts, mess tunics, black tie, white tie, and a surprising number of Nehru-collared velvet frock coats in various hues and paisley patterns. Laid out on the bed, they were boy-sized. Surely too small for a war hero of Group Captain Jeremy McNabb's stature, and the larger-than-life protector of her childhood. Inside, though, she guessed that he was still always just wee jocks. After the war, he'd stayed on in the service, serving in various quasi-honorary roles in Aden, Malaya, and the Caribbean, but he had eventually left, missing the adrenaline of wartime flying and hating the petty politics of peacetime aviation. Ultimately, it was the post-war appeasement of Stalin and the Soviets, and the corresponding betrayal of so many of his wartime comrades from Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere that had sickened him beyond quiet acquiescence. So he'd voted with his feet. For the next few decades, he'd worked in the fishery and tourism industries, supplemented by a reasonable RAF pension that a grateful nation had bestowed on one of her most faithful wartime servants and heroes. He'd also inherited a healthy legacy from his estranged father, who had done rather well in the Far East, but hadn't survived beyond the war. succumbing to liver disease brought on by alcohol and an aggressive liver fluke that he'd contracted after drinking some dodgy water. Melanie sometimes feared alcoholism might be hereditary and had skipped a generation between her great-grandfather and her own mother. It wasn't something she liked to dwell on, but occasionally the fear was enough to stop her from that extra glass and had saved her from many a hangover. Seeing Jocks's finery laid out on the bed, she marvelled, not for the first time, at the dazzling array of gallantry medals and campaign ribbons. She recognized their significance from her studies, but knew scant little of what he'd done to earn them. There was no doubting his long and very active war, as demonstrated by the bewildering array of stars and ribbons, including the 1939-45 and Atlantic Stars, the Aircrew Europe with 2 clasps, the Africa, Italy, France and Germany stars, the War Medal, and even the Canadian Volunteer Service Medal with the Dieppe clasp. Most unexpectedly, they also included the French Chevalier de la Légion d'honneur, the Belgian Croix de Guerre, and even the Royal Albanian Heroes Star. Jocks had been everywhere and must have done exceptional things to merit them, but Melanie couldn't help but wonder what it was that had pushed him to do so much. What demons had driven him to fight and keep on fighting? His uniforms and medals would go to the Imperial War Museum, as was right and appropriate. There she could choose what would go on display and what should be preserved for posterity. She carefully packed everything up for shipping down to Lambeth. Academic research could only take her so far. She wanted a more human, organic telling of Jocks's story. So many witnesses from that time had already passed, and whilst there were recordings of testimonies at the museum, including her grandfather's, she wanted more than that. She decided she needed to see her Uncle Pritch. He was still alive, but he wasn't very well, according to the Royal Star and Garter home in Richmond, London, where he was a long-term resident. But perhaps the maimed and blind old man, once such a formidable and vital ladies' man, could still tell her what she needed to hear. Melanie walked into the Royal Star and Garter home a few days later. Her Uncle Pritch had been a resident for 12 years, since the death of his French wife, Amandine. The couple had always been her favourites, not least because as a child with little or no family, she had called them Parrain and Marine, godfather and godmother. Pritch had been larger than life and desperately good-looking, the epitome of a swashbuckling pirate captain with an eye patch and a single right arm. Amandine had had startling pale blue eyes and dark flyaway hair that she'd always struggled to tame. They'd never had any children, so Melanie became their surrogate daughter. Regular visits from France were always accompanied by a deluge of jolis cadeaux. Always clever, intricately wrapped, and well-considered toys when she was younger, then also chic fashions when she got older. The contrast between the utilitarian apparel that her grandfather bought her and their à la mode gifts was stark and always very welcome. It was a closeness that made Melanie feel terribly guilty about not visiting Uncle Pritch for the last few years. She'd seen him at her grandfather's funeral, but had been too distraught to pay him the attention he deserved. She was ashamed of her behaviour, considering how frail he was, and the fact that he'd come all the way from London. She recalled how terribly thin and confused he'd been, not at all the vibrant old warrior of her childhood. Melanie entered through the imposing metal doorway of the home, beneath the Red Cross medallion set in the carved stone mantel. The Union Jack hung listlessly from a pole between towering sandstone columns. She was nervous, intimidated by the grand edifice, the home of heroes before they embarked on their final journey. After checking in at the reception desk, Melanie was shown to a grand but worn room with several tatty floral sofas. Squadron leader Pritchard would be brought to her, she was told, accompanied by his friend Nancy, one of the other residents at the home. She was one of the few people who could still get through to Pritch. Melanie was warned that he wasn't always very lucid and could sometimes be aggressive and rude. "Please don't expect too much, miss," said the orderly. Pritch was wheeled in, crumpled and tiny in striped pyjamas, a burgundy dressing gown, and monogrammed slippers. His companion was a short, wide-faced lady with silver hair in a bob and bright red lipstick. She pushed Pritch's wheelchair along determinedly, carefully positioning him beside Melanie before applying the brake. When she looked up, her gaze was direct, perhaps challenging, but at the same time somehow haunted. Her smile and piercing dark eyes didn't seem to match. "Hello, dear. My name's Nancy Forward. You can call me Nancy." She spoke in a soft Antipodean accent, and compared to Pritch's sallow skin tone, she was the picture of rude health. The only thing betraying her age was the tremble in her hands, accentuated by the bright vermilion of the varnish on her fingernails. Melanie introduced herself and explained why she was there. "I knew your grandfather very well," Nancy said. "We met several times at the Victoria Cross and George Cross Association meetings over the years. A charming man who always reminded me of my late husband. John was an RAF pilot too." She patted Pritch's shoulder with an affectionate hand. "That's what first got us talking, wasn't it, Pritchy, my darling?" He moved for the first time, his head jerking as he raised his frail right hand. "Come on, let's sit down and see whether we can have a nice convo. That'll be lovely, eh, Pritchy? I've asked them to bring us some tea, dear." "Melanie, my Melanie," he said, pointing. "Bonjour, parrain Pritch," said Melanie, her voice beginning to crack. There, dear," said Nancy. "Try not to get upset, it only sets him off. Speak nice and loudly, calm and clear. He understands everything you say." Pritch nodded and reached out his hand. It was as Melanie remembered. Paler, thinner, and with longer fingernails, but still the hand of a pianist. Jocks had always said that before losing the other hand, Pritch had loved to play. "Who have you been, Uncle Pritch? I'm so sorry I've not been to visit. I was really sad for a long time when Grandpa died." "Brave Melanie," he nodded. "Miss him too. Jocks, my friend." Emotion was welling up within Melanie, and she was struggling to keep it contained. "I'll see Jock soon. Big party, me and him, and the treble ones. All the boys waiting for me." "Parrain, please don't say that," said Melanie in the voice of a little girl who didn't want to be orphaned. "Please don't leave me all alone." "Not alone. Always here. Ghosts of yesterday. I miss my friends and I'm tired. So tired. It's no fun, is it, Nancy?" She shook her head sadly. He brightened and a glimpse of the old Pritch returned in his rheumy eyes. "I'd have chased you around the table back in the day." He gave a wheezing laugh, dissolving into a hacking cough. "I'd have let you catch me, Pritchy darling," replied Nancy. They were still chuckling when the tea was brought in. Melanie served, and she noticed that Uncle Pritch held his cup more steadily than his friend Nancy. "I wanted to ask you a question, Uncle Pritch," said Melanie. "I've been sorting through Grandpa's things and found some items that I know nothing about. Photographs and letters from people I don't recognize." Pritch smiled. "Jocks had many secrets." "Secrets about someone called Alice. Who was she?" "I was the best man instead of George." "I know that. There's a picture of Grandpa with a dog called Georgie." "No, Georgie was my dog. Big George died at Montrose. Jock's got the medal." Melanie wasn't following what he was saying. "I think he means the George Cross. Your grandfather was awarded the George Cross for trying to save someone called George," said Nancy. Pritch nodded. "George Cross, like Nancy." "You were awarded the George Cross too." "The George Medal?
I was an ensign in the first aid nursing yeomanry, but you don't want to hear about me. What were you saying about the best man, Pritchie?
I was best man for Jocks.
He was going to marry Alice. What happened?
Melanie asked.
London's burning, London's burning,
he croaked, then was silent. He crumpled back into his chair. It was as if a door had slammed, and he was stranded behind it. She asked again, but he stared blankly.
I'm afraid he's gone, said Nancy. I'm very sorry, dear. He fades in and out. It's as if he gets tired of remembering and withdraws somewhere safer. Sometimes it lasts for days, and then he'll just pop back. I'll keep asking the questions, and I'll write to you and let you know if I learn anything. You're so very kind, Nancy. Uncle Pritch is lucky to have a friend like you. Don't worry, dear. He helps me too. I've got more than enough of my own demons. We all do in this place. The war did a lot of damage, even after all these years. I'm so grateful he has you. I haven't really been there for him. He deserves much better than that. He meant so much to me when I was a child.
Stop that, said Nancy, with sudden steel in her voice.
It's not for the young to heal the wounds of the previous generations. He loves you and always will. Hold on to that. It's really all he can offer now. I promise I'll let you know if he says anything more about Jocks or this Alice. But hopefully you'll have something to go on.
She glanced at Pritch, who was asleep again.
I think I'd better get him back to his room. He's tuckered out. I'll get the orderly to see you out.
The same woman who had shown Melanie to the room appeared. Melanie tried to give her godfather a kiss on the cheek, but he was completely unresponsive.
Please don't take it to heart, dear, said Nancy. He's not really in there anymore. He's probably already with his dear treble ones. He often talks about Wheelie Ferris, Wolfie Mackenzie, and David the Bruce. Do you recognize those names? Wheelie Ferris sounds familiar. I think he was Grandpa's mentor during the Battle of Britain. He once told me that he organized Wheelie's funeral. It was a sad memory that stayed with him for a long time. Perhaps they're all up there, waiting for old Pritch to arrive and get the party started. If you believe in such things, I guess Jocks will be there too. You don't believe it, Nancy? I find the idea comforting. Comfort, maybe for some, but I've always been too practical and bloody-minded to put faith in that sort of thing. It would have been my dearest wish to see my first husband again, after everything he suffered for me, but I can't have faith that will happen. I've seen far too much darkness to think there'll be light at the end. No, better not to dwell on such things. Goodbye. It was so lovely to meet you. I do hope we'll see you again.
Once back at the reception area, Melanie said to the orderly,
What a remarkable woman, so very gentle and kind. You mean Nancy? I wouldn't exactly describe her as that. She's far too deadly. Deadly? But why? What do you mean? That's Nancy Wake, the White Mouse. During the Second World War, she was the deadliest special operations agent in the whole of occupied France. What? That little old lady? She wasn't always old, but yes, that little old lady. She strangled a strapping SS trooper with her bare hands, apparently. It's funny that you should underestimate her. In fact, her favourite expression about that time is that they couldn't see what was right in front of their noses. I think it was her unthreatening appearance that duped the enemy. She once told me that the first thing she did when she landed by parachute was put on some heels and fresh lipstick. The Nazis never imagined this pretty dolly bird could be dangerous, but she actually led over 7,000 resistance fighters and had a 5 million franc bounty on her head as the Gestapo's most wanted. My lord, what a remarkable woman, said an incredulous Melanie, and so low-key about everything, just wanting to help my uncle. In retrospect, she did perhaps seem somewhat haunted, but I never would have guessed what was behind that. She hides it well, but she has suffered a great deal. Her first husband, a Frenchman, was captured and tortured by the Gestapo, then executed when he wouldn't divulge her whereabouts. She has struggled with the guilt over the years. By the war's end, thanks to her, over 5,000 airmen and soldiers were rescued, and she's one of the most decorated women of the Second World War, with medals from 5 different nations. Nancy Wake is a true legend.
For the next few days, Melanie was busy in her office at the Imperial War Museum. 50 years ago, on the 29th of December 1940, at the peak of the London Blitz, London had come as close to destruction as it ever had. The museum was marking the anniversary with a series of events to demonstrate what had been lost and how the city's landscape had been changed forever. The bombing raid that had occurred that night had come to be known as the Second Great Fire of London. Melanie had been asked to curate an exhibition to commemorate that terrible night. The ditty her Uncle Pritch had started singing kept churning through her head as she planned the exhibition. London's burning, fetch the engines, fire, 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 pour on water, pour on water. It was giving her a headache and she was getting nowhere. She needed to clear her thoughts, so she decided to go for a walk. Picking her coat and beanie hat up to protect her from the chill, she left her office, deep within the IWM building, ready to face the elements. Whilst Melanie was out, a yellow post-it note was left on her desk. She recognized the spidery handwriting of Mrs. Cohen, one of the museum's volunteers. Mrs. Cunningham from the Royal Star and Garter Home called. Please call her urgently. She said you have the number. I'm sorry, dear, but it sounds quite serious. I hope everything's all right. Love, Mrs. C. Melanie's blood ran cold. It was the call she'd been dreading for weeks. Chapter 1. London, Spring 1941. The Henkel throbbed in the night sky like a malevolent locust. The rest of the swarm was scattered in the clouds, amongst the twisting smoke rising from the burning city. Brilliant white flashes strobed shadows against the clouds like spooling celluloid at the end of a projection. Flying Officer Jocks McNabb looked away, keen to avoid burning out his night vision. It was the most precious asset in his armory, and staring at the giant grasshopper perched on the blazing headlight of the city in flames was a bad idea. He eased the nose of his matte-black Supermarine Spitfire Mark 5B down a touch. It bore a discreet RAF roundel and his identifying letters in a muted blood red. Barely visible, only his glowing exhaust manifolds could betray his presence, but only to a very sharp-eyed enemy gunner. Jocks had been following the bomber stream for about 20 minutes. He was a veteran at this, and had the ribbons on his chest to prove it, but stalking his quarry in the pitch dark was new, as was the elegant Spitfire he was in. It was proving a worthy replacement to the Hurricane, the trusty warhorse that had seen him through the chaos of France and England's skies. This new steed already bore his signature GUX, the emblem of a Scottish claymore held aloft, and the name Marguerite IV, etched in a childish scroll. This was in memory of the little French girl he'd been unable to save, but in whose name he had fought through the Battle of Britain. Later, it was for the many friends he'd lost, but now things were personal. His broken heart demanded savage retribution, and this glass-nosed bastard would be the first to pay. Initially, he was guided towards his target by ground radar, but it was then up to him to find the raiders in the shrouded sky. He'd found them low over the Thames estuary, heading upstream like migratory fish, laden with deadly spawn to unload on the sleeping city. He'd positioned himself at 25,000 feet, high above the serried ranks of twin-engine Henkels, picking a target amongst their lumbering forms. He was just a fleeting shadow against the full moon reflecting off the sea. He dropped the Mark V through the formation, then edged towards the vulnerable belly of his intended victim. He held his breath, hoping the maneuver would go unnoticed, then exhaled slowly into his face mask, the cold chamois leather expanding. He reached up a hand and gave it a squeeze, feeling ice crystals fall away, landing against his chin. He'd been up for a while, and the Spitfire was notoriously chilly, since the tight cockpit didn't allow for any bulky clothing. His next breath was a metallic hiss from the oxygen bottle, and he rubbed his legs with gloved hands, trying to get his circulation going. His feet were cold, and he adjusted their position on the rudder pedals. His left foot was dark blue, not from the cold, but a prank in the mess a few weeks ago. Jock smiled bitterly at the memory, an innocent time now long gone. He glanced up, hoping to catch the raider silhouetted against the clouds, lightened by the burning city. The darkness was punctuated by a bright arc of fire. The rings of his targeting sight were on the swollen body looming above him. Jock's let rip with the full force of 4.303 Browning guns and a pair of 20mm Hispano 2 cannons, each with a spring-loaded 60-round drum magazine. The murderous weight of fire hurled at the raider was vastly superior to anything he'd had at his disposal last summer, and he was impressed by the devastation it wrought. A series of explosions ripped open the belly of the bomber, flaring into the night sky so that Jocks could make out the black crosses on the bomber's elliptical wings and the hooked swastika on its stocky tail. Jocks wondered how many of the 5-man crew had survived his blistering attack. Were they terrified, battling the flames and the drag of G-force inside the plummeting aircraft, desperately trying to get out? In the darkness, there was no way of telling, since any blossoming parachutes were instantly snatched away by the roaring slipstream. How many would end up as prisoners or simply die out there in the cold? In his heart, he wanted them dead, burning in that falling wreckage. Christ, what kind of a beast had this war made of him? A second clattering burst arced from the Spitfire's wings, shaking him out of his dark musings. He remembered Sailor Mallon's second rule of air fighting, drummed into their heads at flight school. Whilst shooting, think of absolutely nothing else. He hadn't even realized he'd fired again, so he dropped his nose to clear the disintegrating target from the Spit's notorious blind spot. He watched his victim fall away, a sulphurous yellow tail of flame blazing from ruptured fuel tanks. Like a fiery comet, it was an unexpected thing of beauty. Let up now, all pretense of stealth gone, the startled gunners of other Heinkels blazed away at his shadow. Jocks leant the steering column sharply to the right, spiraling away from the grasping tentacles of red tracer bullets. He grunted at the crushing effect of G-force as he fell, leveling out when he saw another Spitfire engaging a struggling Heinkel about half a mile away. The rest of the number 111 squadron were out there somewhere. Jocks wondered how David Pritchard and Cameron Glasgow were getting on. Glasgow was his wingman, but in the chaos of smoke and cloud he'd lost him. He reached for his RT switch, but recalled that radio silence had been ordered, when it was realized that enemy bombers were monitoring the British channels to counter the recent successes of radar-controlled searchlights. Tonight, the probing beams had been of little use to the hunters, other than ruining their night vision when caught in the blinding glare. Jocks climbed, searching for a second victim. A lumbering candidate loomed in the half-light, only visible because its bomb bay doors were opening. Rising steadily, he slipped behind the unsuspecting raider, too preoccupied with keeping straight and level so as to allow its bomb aimer to peer through his sights. None of the gunners in the nose, dorsal or ventral, beam or gondola positions spotted Jocks' sleek Spitfire. They became aware of his presence only when he opened fire. Then the panicking rear gunner desperately tried to counter, but far too late. The illuminated gun sight traced a stream of cannon fire and bullets through the target, raking the entire length of the aircraft from rear to front. In his wandering thoughts, Jocks could see Mike Wheelie Ferris's earnest face, and his signature tactic of attacking the greenhouse-nosed HE-111s from the front. What he was doing was effectively the reverse. Poor old Mike, his teacher and dear mentor, another comrade lost along the way. There were far too many. The Heinkel reared like a wounded stag, exploding into a ball of fire and oily smoke. The Spitfire punched through the boiling mass of flame, the clear sides of the cockpit streaking with something dark, wet and liquid. A gory slug trail slid from the clear perspex as a soggy fragment of a German airman slipped off the canopy. Jocks levelled off and scanned the horizon, already lightening to a familiar shade of Aberdeen granite grey. In aerial combat, action was often over quickly, and a crowded sky became remarkably empty. Below him, the flames raged on as he tapped his fuel gauge to check the accuracy of the reading. He was running low, and had used up most of his ammo too. The butcher's bill of 2 kills for the night barely sated his hunger for revenge, but it would have to do. Jocks was hit by a wave of grief and utter exhaustion. It was a physical pain in his chest, and he struggled to breathe. He was far too young to be feeling like this. He knew it came from having nothing more to live for. His destiny now was to become his enemy's angel of destruction, until the day when the flames would mercifully come for him too. There was nothing else. It was simply his fate. Chapter 2. It was bitterly cold as Jocks and his sweetheart, Waif Alice Milne, walked hand in hand between the weathered headstones that mark the airmen's section of Sleeping Hillock Cemetery near Montrose. The stones, once perfectly aligned, leant this way and that, shifted by the persistent strong winds off the North Sea. It was as if they were trying to see past one another to discover who was coming to visit. Since the dawn of military aviation in Scotland, airmen had been buried here. Flight was a deadly mistress, and the bleak conditions at RAF Montrose made it a cruel place to learn, as the visiting pair knew all too well.
"Good morning, my darling,"
said Alice, her voice cracking as they reached her brother's headstone.
"Look who I've brought to see you."
"Hello there, old chum," said Jocks. "It's been a while. I'm sorry it's taken so long to come." His sky-blue eyes tracked the lettering cut into the stone. Pilot Officer G.A.E. Milne, Pilot, Royal Air Force, 19th March 1940, age 20. Rest now, darling boy, with our everlasting love. It was the grave of George Milne, one of his few friends, and certainly one of the best. There had been such a terrifying succession of deaths since the beginning of this awful war. The intensity of those friendships was at the utter mercy of the unpredictability and wantonness of war. Dear sweet naive George, tall and gangly with those remarkable cow eyes, had been one of the first to die. Now, Jocks was here to tell him that he hoped to make his sister a bride. Jocks looked to Alice. Her eyes were so like George's. "The thing is, old boy, there have been a lot of changes up here, what with the war and everything," stammered Jocks. "Of course, I knew you had a sister, but, well, Alice and I met at your funeral. Not exactly the best of circumstances, but you know."
"It's such a shame we never spent any time all together," said Alice.
"If George hadn't died, we probably wouldn't have met."
"Oh, I think we would have. He was always talking about you."
She nodded encouragingly.
"Go on, Jocks."
"You see, George, we met again down south during the battle. I was stationed at Croydon and Alice was a controller at Kenley. We've been through an awful lot together. It was a terrible but also a precious summer for us. The weather was glorious, but that only meant that Jerry came over in droves. You remember old Pritch? He got shot down over Dunkirk and hurt his leg. So did I, as it happens. The thing is, George, Alice and I have become very close and, well, we're getting married." Jocks paused, nervously examining his hands. They were still lumpy with the scars from the burning wreck of the Harvard Mark I trainer that he'd pulled George from just a few miles from here. All that felt like such a long time ago, but it had been little more than a year. Jocks and Alice were in their RAF uniforms, with the wind tugging at them. Alice wore her Women's Auxiliary Air Force greatcoat over her skirt and stockinged legs. Her shoulder-length curly blonde hair was tucked in a bun under her cap, and she stood as tall as Jocks. He was in his RAF tunic, the azure rings of his rank on his sleeves, pilot wings on his chest alongside the ribbons of the George Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. The former had been awarded to him for trying to save poor George, and the latter for downing 8 enemy aircraft over France and the south during the previous summer and autumn. "We've been down to the farm to ask for your father's permission, George," said Jocks. "He's been very sad since you died. We have his blessing, but he told us to come and ask for yours." Jocks took a deep breath. "So here I am, George, asking you for Alice's hand." He was feeling rather foolish talking to a mute stone, but was moved by the solemnity of what he was asking. They stood quietly before George's grave. He was taking his time over the answer. High above, a seagull wheeled and gave a plaintive cry. With a thunderous splat, a fishy mess streaked down George's headstone, showering the pair in their pristine uniforms. They jumped back, thoroughly splashed. Jocks was horrified, but Alice was letting out peals of laughter. "That's so bloody typical of Georgie," she cried happily. "He's telling us he approves, but that you'd better watch your step." Jocks was very glad the moment hadn't been completely ruined for his bride-to-be, and spluttered, "Not exactly the sign from God, or George for that matter, that I expected, but I'll take it." He looked down the untidy row of stones and realized that the gulls routinely used them for target practice. He gingerly flicked off a persistent lump sticking to his pilot wings. "George doesn't seem terribly impressed by my wings. Perhaps he's cross he never got that far." Jocks caught himself, cursed, then quickly added, "Well, perhaps he did. A rather finer pair than mine." Alice smiled forgivingly, her eyes filled with happy tears as she took his hand again. "Oh, he's here all right, and as usual he's teasing me. He was always the one to have the last laugh, was my brother." RAF Montrose hadn't changed. It was still bloody bleak, raining most of the time, and always windy. Busier than Jocks remembered, there were many more training courses being held than when he was last here as a fresh-faced trainee. In truth, he was still rather fresh-faced. Tomorrow would be his 20th birthday, and the boys were throwing him a party in the mess. Sadly, it was the boys that had changed most of all. Jocks, Pritchard, and the rest of number 111 Squadron, the Treble Ones, were back at number 8 Flying Training School, RAF Montrose, for conversion from their trusty Hurricanes to sleek new Spitfire Mark Vs. Like most Hurricane pilots, they were rather protective of their current steeds, especially since all the newspapers and the wireless always made such a fuss about Spitfires. It was as if the little fighters had won the Battle of Britain on their own, when any pilot worth his salt knew that it was the old Hurricane that had done most of the heavy lifting. Jocks really wasn't keen to swap, but if it meant to change from the endless coastal patrols over the Firth of Forth from RAF Drem, and now over the northeast of Scotland from RAF Dice near Aberdeen, then he was up for it. The only excitement he'd had over the last 6 months were the occasional high-altitude interceptions of reconnaissance aircraft, more often than not long fruitless chases with little resulting action. At Montrose, the Treble Ones were not only to be converting to Spitfires, but their role was changing. They were to become night fighters. They were to train in a new tactic, codenamed SMAC. S-M-A-C-K. Britain's cities were being battered by the Luftwaffe's nightly bomber raids, operating with relative impunity. Since the 7th of September 1940, London alone had been bombed for over 40 nights in succession. The plan now was that the new SMAC procedure would vector Spitfire interceptors onto the raiders, guided by earthbound radar-controlled searchlights pointing in the direction of flight of the bomber stream. Once the code word CONE, C-O-N-E, was signaled, several search beams would converge, locking onto a detected bomber, illuminating it for the stalking Spitfires to find and destroy. In theory, the tactic was sound, and Britain's cities could certainly do with respite from the nightly raids. In practice, though, the Spitfire was proving hard to take off and land in the dark. Its notorious blind spot to the front and powerful torque-producing Merlin engine swinging the aircraft off its line. It didn't bode well that the squadron had suffered several aircraft damaged in training and had tragically lost 2 pilots in a mid-air collision. The faces of the squadron had changed enormously from the ragged men who'd survived the trying days of last summer. Squadron leader John "Tommy" Thompson, the charismatic CO, had been promoted and moved on to become acting wing commander IC, flying training for 11 Group HQ. He was now the station commander at RAF Southend. Jocks missed the bear-like former rugby player who had become a surrogate father figure to his young subordinate, as so many of their friends and comrades had fallen during the meat-grinder summer of the Battle of Britain. Thompson had been by his side when His Majesty the King had decorated them both at Buckingham Palace, watched proudly by Alice and Thompson's chatty wife Sylvia. Since then, squadron leader Arthur J. Bigger, an old India hand, had led them for 5 months, swiftly replaced by a Kiwi, Johnny McLean, who had lasted just 6 months before moving on too. Their latest commanding officer was George "Wee Broch" Brochy, a veteran of France who had missed much of the Battle of Britain through injury, then serving as an instructor. He was a good-looking little man with a clipped moustache, but was known to be a bit of a martinet with a chip on his shoulder for not being one of the few. His low kill count compared to some of the aces in the squadron also grated. Since the Battle of Britain, the squadron had been reorganized into 4 sections of 4 aircraft each, referred to as a Finger 4 squadron. On patrol now, each section flew in a formation like the fingernails of the right hand, spread across a frontage of 200 meters. This approach had been shamelessly copied from the Luftwaffe once the weakness of the RAF's previous tactics had become obvious. The routine losses of the aircraft at the rear, the exposed tail-end Charlies, often the least experienced pilots, had provided damning evidence. The Battle of Britain had certainly taken an atrocious toll on No. 111 Squadron, like so many others, and the RAF was simply struggling to fill the gaps. This was despite the flurry of highly motivated foreign pilots from many invaded nations and Britain's dominions that had flocked to the ranks. The squadron's duty roster certainly looked very different. The old lags included Jocks, leading A-Flight, with trusty Flight Sergeant Cameron Glasgow as his wingman. Miroslav Mansfield, an experienced Czech pilot, led the second element, with a replacement sergeant pilot under his tutelage. Squadron leader Brochy's wingman was David Pritchard, Jocks' best friend, who'd been through basic training with him. He was also to be Jocks' best man at his forthcoming wedding. Red Section's second pair was led by Chevalier Olivier de Gelink, a Belgian aristocrat known as Gilly, who had proven his deadly worth during the autumn's onslaught. He was also waiting for a replacement wingman. Pete Simpson, the most senior of Thompson's surviving flight leaders, led B-Flight. He was backed by South African Tom Wallace, a skilled ex-officer broken to sergeant pilot for disciplinary issues involving a girl. He was also recovering from wounds and steadily making his way from under the cloud of his court-martial. Yellow Section's second element also needed replacements, as did Green Section. From when Jocks first joined the squadron at RAF Northolt in May 1940, only Pritchard, Glasgow, Simpson and the adjutant, Badger Robertson, were familiar faces. The Treble Ones had lost well over 100% of its personnel in little more than 12 months. What was left of the hard-won combat experience lay in the hands of some shockingly young men, prematurely labelled as veterans. Only Badger Robertson, Cam Glasgow and Miro Mansfield were older than 23, and the adage that war is declared by old men, but it is the youth that fight and die, was never more apt. Chapter 3. Jocks really wasn't looking forward to the birthday party planned in his honour, and was only going because Pritchard had put so much effort into it. It was also an opportunity for Alice to meet the new faces in the squadron. She was on leave after her previous posting at RAF Kenley, which she'd left under a bit of a cloud following her engagement to Jocks. There was also the fracas with a certain scar-faced squadron leader, the Kenley controller and her boss, who'd had his own designs on her. Jocks had put a stop to that, but it had involved blows, certainly conduct unbecoming, between officers. Jocks had escaped a court-martial, receiving only a reprimand, thanks to Thompson and the fact that he had been about to be decorated for valour by His Majesty the King. Alice's new posting was as a plotter at the Cabinet War Rooms in central London, an opportunity she was looking forward to, but which concerned Jocks since she would be in the eye of the storm. The Blitz was continuing to take a devastating toll on the city and its exhausted inhabitants. She would brook no discussion, though, determined to do her part in the war effort. Jocks couldn't fault her for that, and as ever he loved her spirit, recognizing that she was also trying to make up for her brother's tragic early demise. Previous generations of the Milnes had done their duty in the muddy hell of the trenches during the Great War, and in George's absence, she felt it was up to her to do her bit. Earlier that day, Jocks had left her at their boarding house in Montrose, as she made party arrangements with Pritchard. He was taking his role as their best man very seriously. Jocks took a cargo flight up to RAF Dice to rendezvous with 2 new replacements for Yellow Section, with orders to shuttle them back to Montrose in a trio of Squadron Hurricanes that had just completed their 200-hour services. He'd volunteered for the duty, knowing there wouldn't be many more opportunities to fly his trusty Hurricane, Marguerite III, once the Treble Ones had completed their conversion to a night fighter role on new Spitfire Mark Vs. Upon landing, he caught up with his ground crew in the maintenance sheds at Dice Airfield, where they were finalizing routine technical inspections before handing over their beloved Hurricanes. They were led by red-haired Flight Sergeant Barnes, a tall rigger responsible for his aircraft's airframe, with Dublin-born Corporal Black, whose domain was the aircraft's excellent Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and finally leading aircraftman tech Smithy, his plumber, as the armourers were known. Together they'd seen him through the Battle of Britain, saving his skin on more than one occasion, and he trusted them like few others. "Don't worry, the old girl's doing fine, sir," said Barnes. "Just a few fissures in the wood-braced fuselage near the wing struts, and a couple of worn-out fabric panels that need replacing. All sorted now. Blackie found an oil leak too, but then again Blackie always finds one." The grimy Irishman grinned from his position, flat on his back beneath Marguerite III's oily propeller housing. "Smithy tells me that the rifling in one of the guns is worn out too. It's firing completely skew-whiff, so he's replaced it. No one's ever going to say the Treble One engineering crews handed over any lame ducks. I don't think anyone would ever dare do that flight," said Jocks, with real affection for his doughty rigger and crew chief. "How are things going with the new Spitz?" "I'll be honest, sir, I'm not a great fan," replied Barnes. Jocks was surprised to hear this verdict, when so many air personnel involved with Spitfires raved about them. "For a start, I know they're faster than the Hurricane, with all that all-metal aluminium monocoque business. But if one of them snappers or a canny gunner in a Jerry bomber catches a piece of you, you'll know all about it. The metal of this bird will get all twisted up. The old Hurricane can take a lot more damage with its doped fabric over a wooden frame without falling to bits." The big rigger laughed. "But who am I telling? You've taken on more than your fair share of hits, sir. What are we on now, Marguerite 2 or 3? "This one's my 3rd, said Jocks sheepishly. "I guess the Spit will be number 4. "Same paint job on the Spit, sir?" "Yes, please," replied Jocks. "Maybe tone things down a bit for night fighting. I don't want a lot of bright colours giving me away when I'm trying to creep up on one of those big bastards." He reached instinctively for the porcelain doll's arm that he kept in his tunic pocket. It had belonged to Marguerite, a little refugee he'd met and lost by the roadside in beleaguered France. Her name had been on his aircraft ever since. "Righto, sir, but you know that's not really the problem with the Spit," continued Barnes. "During the Battle of Britain, we could turn around old Marguerite here in less than 10 minutes, 9 minutes max. That's a complete service, mind.
Rearm, refuel, and a new oxygen bottle rigged up, ready for you to get back up there. You remember we even slept in the blast pens to get things done as fast as we could.
Yes, and your ground crews paid the price, said Jocks, remembering the 5 killed when RAF Croydon was bombed on the 15th of August during the height of the battle. Barnes stood mute for a moment, then shook his shaggy red head to chase away the memories. No, the problem is the fastest we've been able to turn around a Spitfire has been 26 minutes, almost 3 times longer than the Hurricane. Struth, I had no idea. You know, sir, if we'd only had Spits and no Hurricanes, I really don't think we could have withstood the Jerrys last summer, said the thoughtful rigger. One of the warrant officers from the engineering branch told me that we only had about 500 Hurricanes and 300 Spitfires facing over 2,500 Jerry aircraft. If the numbers of our fighters had been reversed, we wouldn't have stood a chance. We just couldn't have got enough up in the air to fight them off. Well, we've got a lot more now, and our job is to get Jerry off the backs of the civvy population, rather than protecting our shipping, radar stations and airfields like last summer. I'm certainly more invested in getting stuck into protecting our people than installations. We're with you on that, sir, replied Barnes. Blackie's got family in Kilburn, and Smithy's people live by the river down in Chelsea, which has taken a real pasting. They've been bombed out twice, but thankfully no one was killed.
We hope you enjoyed this preview. To continue listening to this audiobook on Google Play Books, use the link in the video description.